The problem with calling Trump a threat to democracy is that we have a really narrow idea of what it looks like when democracies fail. We imagine democratic failure as being some spectacular event, a military coup, or an illegal power grab, or the declaration of martial law.
To protect the Republic of the Philippines and our democracy.
Rising nationalism in many parts of the world. Politicians like Trump, Putin, Erdogan have become a manifestation of putting my nation first.
You have an uprising against the political establishment. You have enduring economic anger and anxiety, and you have a rise of nationalism and a desire to pull back from international entanglements.
How can we bring back a democratic debate in which our different opinions enrich each other?
Populists often take this approach as they tap into the backlash against immigration and a globalized economy that many voters feel has left them behind.
Britain is stepping up its search for alleged Russian influence in its affairs after UK researchers claim that more than 400 Twitter accounts tried to sway voters on Brexit.
We've all learned in the last few months, whether it's Americans with the election, or whether it's in the UK with the Brexit, or really worldwide, there's really an angst about opportunity. People around the world want opportunity. They want the idea that if you work hard, the system will reward you.
Well, our world is undergoing rapid change. With climate change, mass migration, fake news, resurgent nationalism on the rise, are our political systems and ideals up for the challenge? Despite many claiming that our accepted values and norms appear vulnerable on a number of fronts, many young people still feel politically disenfranchised. And in most Western countries, 18 to 24-year-olds continue to have the lowest turnout numbers for any voting age group. So with these issues at the doorstep of democracies worldwide, how will our world function politically in the decades to come? Hello, good afternoon. My name is Lúcás R and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I would like to begin by welcoming you all to the Youth Forum Switzerland and to ISLM. So our time together today is quite short, and so our discussion will be divided between a moderated discussion with our panelists and then an open question and answer session with the audience. But first, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists here today. Beside me is Anja Guelpa, who served as the first female Chancellor of Geneva and now works as the Director of Civic Lab, a think tank founded last year. Beside her is Ben Buckland, whose work as an independent oversight advisor for the Association for Prevention of Torture has brought him all around the world from Rwanda to Mongolia. Beside him is Peter Hess. Peter is a practicing lawyer here in Zug and former Swiss politician who was Speaker of the Nationalrat in 2001. And beside Peter is Rosie Garthwaite, who is a journalist, producer, author, and a senior documentary producer at the BBC. So, I'd like to kick this panel off by asking, or by saying rather, that I can speak on behalf of many in the audience when I say that there's this sense of alarm surrounding democracy, and it hasn't been lost on young people. We're given this sense that the world as we know it is slowly falling apart in a way. So, to what extent is democracy actually in crisis? Ben, you just asked.
Thanks a lot. It's a big question. I think maybe I'd start by talking about a book that I read last year that was really thought-provoking. It was the autobiography of a guy called Stefan Zweig, who was a Jewish Austrian novelist who lived through the early part of the 20th century, and he wrote his autobiography kind of as a epilogue and a kind of requiem for European culture, which he saw when he finished it. He wrote it in the 40s as he was a refugee in, I think, Brazil when he wrote it, a refugee from the Second World War. And he sent the manuscript off to his publisher, and he and his wife committed suicide the next day. It was 1942, and you imagine that 1942 was kind of a turning point in the war, and if maybe he'd waited a little bit longer, he would have seen that things were about to get dramatically better. And I think that perspective is maybe useful in thinking about these big questions about is democracy dying or not, because I think the trend line of history is really good, but there are clearly bumps in the road, and it seems like we're at one of those points where maybe things are about to get worse or are already quite bad before they potentially get better. So I think in the long term, I think there's really good reason for optimism, but maybe in the short term, there's reason for us to be worried.
And Anja, you've held some of the highest positions of power in Switzerland, and I was wondering what your take on that question would be. Do you think democracy is in crisis here in Switzerland or worldwide?
I definitely think that it is in crisis, maybe a little bit less in Switzerland. Probably our direct democracy and the fact that the people have so much power kind of prevents us, but globally I love your optimism and I will keep it in mind, but yeah, I'm worried because there is an erosion of democracy. Less and less people think that democracy is the best system to govern us, and I would have never thought that people in Italy, people in France, people in the United States, so they're not in a country where they've never known democracy, they are used to democracy, and some of them are so afraid of globalization, of losing their jobs. I don't know what it is exactly, but they're so afraid that they think that it would be better to have a strong leader who brings us out of our troubles rather than decide together what is best. I kind of can't believe it, still can't believe it.
Peter, you're our other Swiss politician on the panel. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think we are in a rather exceptional situation here in Switzerland, where we still experience stability, maybe also as a consequence of the focus of the democratic engagement on the community canton level and only exceptionally on the federal level. But you are rightly in stating that the recent developments in also neighboring countries is alarming for us because it makes life more difficult. And I think as far as Switzerland is concerned, we have to make an appeal, especially to the young generation, to get involved again. Because I think my generation, we experienced the situation with economic success. We overcame poverty, etc. And my feeling is that to a certain extent we tend to be satirized, and try to keep what we have. And this is, of course, negative in the sense that it prevents us from being innovative, or from being open for change, etc. And you know better than I what is going on actually in the technology, with the communication, etc. And if we are not open and able to adhere to this change, I think maybe we suffer from it.
And Rosie, you've worked for quite a long time in the Middle East, and thus you've seen the often quite violent breakdowns in democracies there. Do you see some of these challenges that kickstart those breakdowns? Do you see those traits being replicated in Europe?
At the very beginning of my career, which was probably just about when you guys were being born, in 2003, I was in Iraq when it went from Saddam Hussein to whatever came next, and we're still going through that process now. And I remember talking to people, and they would explain to me that the reason why democracy doesn't work in the Middle East is because in the Middle East, there's no water, and people have to come to the river or to the leader for their resource. Whereas in Europe, you can put your hand out of the window and you can catch rain in your hand. And it's much more beautiful in Arabic when they say this an explanation. And I used to say, listen guys, give it some time, infrastructure has changed, you don't all need to come to the river, there's pipelines, there's all sorts of things. And I had great hope for democracy in the Middle East when I was first going over there. But I have to say, having witnessed the attempts to introduce it, it's been, I feel like it's almost a canary for what we're seeing now in the West as well. If you look at the Arab Spring, 8 years ago, a lot of the dictators would say they were overturned by Facebook, basically. And what we're seeing today in Europe and in the West is the use of the propaganda machine on a scale that we've we've never seen before, more targeted than it's ever been seen before, and in the media, we are facing a crisis of how do we make, non-fake news stand out from fake news, and what can we do to help get independent journalism and excellent journalism to independent minds that aren't already swayed in one way or another. It's very difficult.
I mean, I would like to talk about that technology aspect for a little bit, because, if you look at something like Brexit, which is one of the defining political moments of our generation, for sure, you see this bizarre situation where one side claims there can't be a second vote because that would be undemocratic, and the other side claims that there must be because the first one was influenced undemocratically. So you've got Russian influence via social media, data companies like Cambridge Analytica. How do you think technology is going to change the way that the democratic process works in the future?
For me, it's the biggest threat.
The biggest threat?
Yes. Even though I'm a digital optimist, and during my 2 mandates, I really fought for e-voting, so for trying what can digital help us with civic tech, how can it help us to bring more transparency, more accountability, and to engage more young people. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, like Cambridge Analytica, it's really a threat on the real basis of our democracy, because one man, one vote, one woman, one vote, and there you have millions, 1 million and a couple of votes, and I don't know how we can prevent that. I know how to fight against hackers, how to try to demotivate them to attack us, but I don't know how to fight back on these fields, and it's really extremely difficult because they are hacking the minds of these people, and I think it's really an open question, and maybe one day, as I said this morning, maybe one day when you use an algorithm, you will have to tell people what's inside, because as we have it for drugs or for some food, but it's really difficult. And in the Brexit situation, I wouldn't want to be in their position. It's a really difficult thing. But democracy is often very difficult. Like, for example, the referendum of Scotland. I had the chance to go to Scotland, discuss with a lot of people just before, and I realized that about 2/3 of the people wanted more autonomy than they had, and about a third didn't want to leave. But the question was, do you want to leave? And often reality is a bit more complicated than just yes and no.
Yeah. And Ben, we've seen fairly disturbing headlines that say that the persecution of the Rohingya, for example, in Myanmar, was influenced in part by websites like Facebook. Do you see, you work all over the world to prevent torture. Has that played a role? Do you think that's the biggest threat to democracies?
Sure it has. I think there are two. I think the biggest problem is that social media allows us to kind of lock ourselves in our own, in echo chambers with people who completely agree with us, where our views are amplified rather than challenged. I think to bring it back to something that, because I'm sure Rosie can talk much more authoritatively than I can about media and the challenges of media, but to bring it back to something that I know about. I work with institutions, and I think the biggest, if you look at the US in the 20th century, consistently about 20% of people support like demagogues and authoritarian type politicians. And the reason that Trump is now in power now and hasn't been in the past is it's about institutions. It's about strong institutions, and it's about strong institutions of governance, and judiciary, and political parties, and parliaments. But it's also about strong media institutions and strong civil society, and those things providing a check on the rise of authoritarians. And I think, it's interesting, Brexit, you mentioned, it's interesting that in the UK after Brexit, that May became Prime Minister and not Boris Johnson, who's clearly the more populist. And I think that suggests that actually the institution of the political party, the Tory party, which is not my preferred side of politics, but that actually provided a check on the really extreme version of populism that was at least rearing its head.
But I mean, we see 2 years later, I mean, just with the vote that occurred earlier this week, that May's position of power is severely diminished now. Do you think that we will see a swing back towards more established politicians like that, or is she more a sort of a blip in the
What's going to happen in the UK in the next year of politics is a really, really difficult question to answer. I really don't know. I hope so. I mean, I think that looking at Brexit, looking at Trump, I think that actually the institutions of American and British democracy are holding up quite well. I mean, the Justice Department in the US is investigating a whole bunch of allegations. The courts are working, the media is working. I mean, I think that there are real reasons to be concerned, but in terms of how these big institutions are holding up, I think there's also reasons to be optimistic about it.
You had something to add?
Yeah, maybe just another point. I'm quite optimistic about public debate. If there is a public debate, it kind of can fight back fake news and emotional discussions. We have that, as we vote the whole time in Switzerland, we have some examples where there is a referendum about something very emotional, and very often in the beginning it's a populistic discussion, and often this field has the majority in the beginning of the discussion, and the later the discussion goes on, the more rational it is. I observed that several times. So probably if you really discuss something in depth, at the end people will see that it's not true. It works on social media and one thing, but if you have the discussion during 3 months, in general, the truth comes to the surface.
I would like to switch gears slightly for the last section of the panel. Now we've talked about how sustainable democracy is in the decades to come and the challenges of technology and such things, but when we talk about sustainability, what comes to mind for me, of course, is climate change, right? And a recent report where the top scientists warned we only have 12 years to limit the catastrophe. That, there's a lot of bad press around this. Rosie, how do we see climate change changing the way that democracy works? Or, rather, will democratically elected governments ever be able to properly implement the measures needed to combat it?
I think there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, especially in Europe and in Brexit Britain, that there's a limited amount of resources and that there are people coming and taking the resources, and that's all to do with sustainability. And if politicians can do more to explain and solve that perception and to explain the realities and some positive solutions, then that fear factor will do an awful lot to get rid of to get rid of some of those problems. And also, if there can be an understanding of the value of people within an economy to do the work that maybe others aren't willing to do, again, that could go a long way towards changing that this kind of this movement against refugees and migrant workers.
But I mean, we heard this morning from the speeches this morning, we've heard throughout the day that really it's time for action, and that we really need to start changing. We can't limit the stuff that we're doing already. We need to completely switch paths. We look at governments like China, which are decidedly autocratic, but have become global leaders in policy on limiting the effects. And we look at democratic countries like America, which have whole political parties which up until a few years ago weren't acknowledging the existence of climate change. I mean, can we honestly say that democracy is capable of preventing this challenge? Anja, or Peter?
Well, I think if I go back to the 90s, 30 years ago, when I was in Parliament, we had the first big incident, the so-called forest dying, Waldsterben. And I remember it was so dramatic. We saw that trees in the forest died, etc. And in Parliament, I think, whenever the government would have asked for billions of credits to fight against it, it would have been accepted, you know. Only later on we then realized what eventually happens, but I think that was the beginning of some better acceptance of the fact that there is a dramatic change going on in the system. And nowadays, I think the overall line is positive, although, of course, you have not guaranteed that, for instance, the majority in Parliament is following that path. So, for instance, there is one of the big parties who has in his program clearly the goals for 2050, etc. But if it comes to vote in Parliament, there is just recently in the House of Representatives a negative majority against Europe, you know. And I think here it's really the people, the young generation again, who has to stand up and say, no, we want to do this, you know. An example is also in the States, you know, where Trump says there is no problem with climate change, but if you go to California, you see that one individual state is capable of doing many positive steps against the overall federal trend, you know. Maybe also because of their experience with forest fire, with floodings, etc. You know.
Well, I mean, if we're seeing the effects of climate change already, it's only at that point that certain states are going to take action. And I guess my question would be, are there alternatives to democracy that are viable in these times of near crisis?
I think the main problem is growth. We are all addicted to growth. We all think, politicians, companies, we all think that growth is the solution because that's what we learned in books for economics, but it doesn't work. There is no endless economic growth. And I think that what Mark said a little bit this morning, companies are very happy. They can say we reduced our emissions for 30-40%. Okay, but it's not enough. We are consuming too many resources. And that's also a political problem because growth is good for everyone. Growth is good for the right-wing parties because it's more. When you say growth, it's more profit. But it used to be also good for the left-wing parties because so they have more taxes because there is growth, and so they can distribute this money. But there is not an endless growth. It's not possible. It's like Kate Roberts tells it in her book. It's like a plane that goes up and up. No, there must be down. There is nothing grows forever. It doesn't exist.
And so,
can I just,
yes, please.
Sorry, there's a few really interesting fact-busting things going on in the world right now. They're coming from people like Mozilla, Google are doing a pretty good job actually, and lots of other organizations which are aiming to kind of fact-check Trump's speeches in live time and fact-checking Fox News and fact-checking CNN and BBC, I'm sure as well. And what I think that there is a big difference between the way things look and the way things actually are. And when people are living in their villages, they realize that although Trump is talking about all of these new jobs, they realize that those jobs are not in their village, or if they are, they're very low paid, and they're not bringing the benefits that they hope for. I remember one important film I saw recently. Steve Bannon was on a tour of Europe, and he was going from place to place around Europe. And he had a journalist from the Guardian newspaper following him. It's only a short film, you can find it online. And essentially what the journalist worked out was that all of these right-wing parties and the people at the events, much like this, when anyone said, do you know, when the journalist asked, do you know who Steve Bannon is and what he stands for? Steve Bannon being the architect of Trump's rise to power. Everybody in those right-wing audiences that we're reading so much about in Europe, none of them really knew who he was or what he stood for. So it turned out that Steve Bannon was actually photobombing these right-wing events and gaining the traction that he wanted from it, and the perception that there was this great connection between the US and Europe. But actually it wasn't true. And so there's a big difference between reality.
If I could maybe just add I think another way to phrase your question about climate change and democracy is to say, how do we build coalitions across political divides that help us to face up to really serious challenges? And I think one of the ways to do it, and I don't know that much about climate change, but one of the ways to do it is to think about different languages and different arguments we can use depending on the audiences that we're talking to. And so in my domain of human rights, I would love it if all you had to do was to say that torture is unethical. But if I'm talking to a police officer in Mauritania where the justice system just completely doesn't work, and he's arrested someone and has no ability to conduct any kind of investigation, he doesn't have a fingerprint kit or anything, he's like, well, I know it's the guy who did it, I'm just going to beat him up and then he's punished and it's fine. What language can I use? Can I be like, well, the UN Convention on Torture says it's about it. Like, he doesn't care. And I think to think about what language and what arguments we can use to push us all in the same direction, whether it's climate change or human rights, that people on the other side of political divides or the other side of ideological divides or wherever are going to make sense. And so in our work, we've spent a lot of time working on stuff about effectiveness. So we have a big project on this thing called investigative interviewing, where it's basically a technique that police officers can use when they're interviewing suspects that leads to really good outcomes that aren't based on confessions. Because when you have a confession-based system, then you want to beat people up so that they confess. So the argument is about effectiveness. And I think we also make economic arguments about when you have 80% of your detainees are in pre-trial detention, they're not out there working and they're not paying taxes, and you have to pay to keep them. You have to pay to keep them in detention. And I think I think you can make arguments about economics, about effectiveness, about law, about human rights, about justice, depending on who your audience is. And I think that's the key to building these big coalitions that we need to deal with these really big problems, whether they're human rights issues or whether they're climate change or whatever else.
So adapting the conversation.
Yeah, thinking about what the language that your audience speaks and changing the way, the arguments you make and the language you use to fit that audience.
So being inspired by Cambridge Analytica, using their methods, kind of.
I mean, I wish we could continue this further. We are obviously on a time limit though, so I'd like to thank you all for the fascinating contributions. We're going to open the discussion up to the audience, so we're going to take a 2 to 3 minute break where you can generate questions. And please, using the hashtag above, I'll see all your Twitter questions and we will relay them back to the panel, so please do send them in, and in 3 minutes time we'll go back to the audience for questions. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to resume the panel, and I think we'll go for a question from the audience first of all. So we have a roving mic, so just put your hands up, and I think we'll go get somewhere over here.
Hello? Is that on? Yeah. My name is Ben Ashton. I have a question. During Brexit, I was talking to my granddad. He had cancer at the time, and he was worried that what the Brexiteers were saying about paying millions to the EU was going to take away, was risking his cancer treatment that was being paid through the NHS. How would you convince someone through that fake that there was that money wasn't going to be spent on the NHS anyway, and that was just part of the EU deal? That he thought his life was at risk if he voted against Brexit. How would you convince him that that was a lie when he's scared for his life?
It's an excellent question. Who would like to start?
Because I'm British, I have to. Okay. Well, firstly, if he was voting Remain, is that what you were saying? He wanted to vote Remain. So the big bus, we're talking about the bus. Yeah. So we were talking earlier about echo chambers. You used the word echo chamber, and I think historically there has always been echo chambers. Your great-great-great-grandfather would have lived in a house, and if he had the ability to vote, which he may not have done more than 100 years ago, then he would have probably voted exactly the same as everyone else on the street and would never have questioned it, and the street would have probably looked to whoever was benefiting them, and they would have voted in that direction. So I think it's not something completely new that people listen to the things around them and can't be convinced. But in terms of combating fake news, it's a hard one. I make my parents listen to some of the right-wing radio stations whenever I'm with them so that they can understand what's going on the other side. And the more you get used to it and listening to other people's opinions, the more open you might be to understanding there is another opinion. But it takes a lot of time to convince people that any other opinion is worth their time. So I think it's about forcing people to change the dial, to change the channel, to when you've been sitting inside your bubble for half an hour on the internet, they force you to go and look at something else. I don't know what the solution is. The British media did a terrible job during Brexit. They didn't do enough to challenge. They were far too beholden to the idea of fairness and giving false opinions airtime on both sides. And so, yeah, it was a disaster.
I mean, when we talk about Brexit, I remember in the aftermath there was this article that became quite controversial where someone had written an article basically talking about how we need to curtail voting rights because stupid people shouldn't be allowed to vote. It's something that a lot of people disagreed with, but we've got a question from the audience on Twitter from Erica Novelli, and she's asked, should there be any restrictions on who is allowed to vote in a democracy? Anja?
No, there shouldn't. No. Why should there? No, I think it was too long enough where women couldn't vote or people who didn't have citizenship. Everyone should vote, but probably we were at just a small discussion before where Ben said, yes, it's possible in Switzerland, direct democracy, because you're used to it and it's difficult to scale. I'm not sure that it's definitely not easy, but I'm sure that you can scale it in a bigger country. But you need to have that culture. You need to, Switzerland is an ongoing dialogue between citizens and the authorities, and the authorities have a responsibility to explain, and parties have a responsibility to explain. Media, the ones we still have, they have a responsibility to make these quite technical sometimes, or most of the time complicated questions, make them more simple. And I'm sure it's possible. And maybe the Brexit, it's really the example not to what you shouldn't do, because it's a non-identified democratic object, because there was no constitutional form of it. It was a way for a politician to continue his career. Even the intention wasn't really a good one, and that's normal. And then people are not really used to it, and maybe also Remainers were afraid to say that they wanted to remain. I couldn't hear a lot of people putting passion into and to show people what it would be when they remain. We saw a lot of pictures of what is not okay and not enjoyable with European Union, where there were no one giving good images, and that's also what we have to do to be able to convince different audiences and have that debate, and not just being on a coffee table discussion or pub discussion.
Yeah, Peter.
I think it's not my job to criticize the British, but from a Swiss point of view, I'm rather surprised that once the people has voted for the Brexit, they are not allowed to vote about the result of the negotiations for the Brexit. And I think my feeling is that maybe the Parliament is hesitating whether the people would express it in their view. In Switzerland, we have made at several opportunities the experience that the people is well responsible for their rights. For instance, we have at several opportunities had to vote whether we want to reduce the working time. People say no, because we are convinced that we can only be successful if we work. Or if we, for instance, just the last important vote, whether Swiss law should be exceeding or in supremacy about international law. huge majority said no, we are bound to international because we are part of a worldwide community. And I think this is a clear expression of the responsibility of the people if it comes really to the point.
I mean, we've talked a lot about the positives of Swiss democracy. In fact, it really is it's working in many senses, but Switzerland, despite having, consistently voting all the time, there is still this trend of a really low voter turnout among young people. Do you think, what are the negatives to Swiss democracy that are turning young people away from voting?
Well, if you want to compare you can't compare the numbers necessarily with all the countries, because in a lot of countries like the US or France, you have to register to be able to vote, which is not the case in Switzerland. So in these countries, the turnout, you counted who voted on who is interested by voting. In Switzerland is who voted on the whole population, so the numbers are a little bit different. And the other thing, I really fight and fought to engage more young people. I think it's extremely important, but I think in Switzerland you cannot only look to the turnout, you also have to look to the numbers of trust into government. And because it's not the same if people don't go to an election in, say, Russia because they say, well, whenever I vote, it won't change anything, or if they don't go to a vote because they don't really have an opinion on the specific subject and they trust the others to vote. So I think it's not such, in Switzerland where there is a huge trust in government, it's not such a problem that there's only 50-55% of the people voting. But young people, I think that's a bit of trouble, and especially if they get older and they still not.
The trend continues.
Yeah. Most of the, unfortunately, people start voting when they start paying taxes, so they kind of feel like shareholder of the company. But they shouldn't wait until then.
Yeah. I think we'll redirect to another question from
the Australian system's interesting though. Do people know about the Australian system?
So in Australia it's compulsory to vote. And I was thinking about making that point that actually is to flip around the question from the audience about whether we should further restrict voting or not expand it more. And I think lowering the voting age seems to make sense, but also making it compulsory to vote. I think one of the things that it does in Australia is that, in other countries, politicians have to try really hard to get people out to the polls. And one of the ways some politicians do that is to make them afraid, to say, you better vote, otherwise bad stuff is going to happen. If you don't have to do that, if people have to show up anyway, then I think that lowers the heat of the political debate significantly. And obviously Australian politics isn't perfect, but I think that's one way in which Australian politics is better than in many other countries.
Yeah.
Also,
sorry, I'm so sorry.
One last thing on Brexit is that there were educated and uneducated people on both sides of the vote, and people voted based on their feelings, not necessarily on the facts. And I think the more you can do to create empathy between communities, whether that's forcing them to listen to the other side or, I don't know, there's thousands of ways to do that, that would also attract people more to be involved, I think.
Yeah. We'll transition to another audience question, I think, if we have the roving mics.
Hi, I'm Josh from Basel, International School of Basel, and my question is to the four of you. Wouldn't a logical way to explain the decrease of democracy in certain countries such as Europe is because of nationalism, and how for centuries those countries have never had a democratic system? While democracy was invented in Europe, a lot of Europe was still under the rule of, the strong man or the strong woman. So wouldn't a logical explanation for democracy dying out in Europe is because they're trying to return to the nationalistic roots and looking back at the heritage?
I mean, maybe part of an answer to that. I think when I see the title of the panel about is democracy dying and thinking about is democracy dying in different parts of Europe or not, I think we need to break it down into lots of different things. And I think people often they think democracy, that's voting. And democracy is way more than that. And I think one really interesting data point is that in 2011-12, after Chavez had been an authoritarian leader in Venezuela for a decade, a solid majority of people in Venezuela, when polled, said they still lived in a democracy because they could still go and vote. But all of the institutions of the state and the media and civil society and all these things have been completely hollowed out. And I think we need to think about democracy in a broader sense than just going to the polls. And I think we need to think about it in terms of how strong is the media, how strong are civil society organizations, how strong are the courts, how strong is the separation of powers between the executive and the legislative. And when it comes to media, how strong is local media too? Because I think, the Trump years have been boom years for the New York Times and the Washington Post. They've never been stronger, I think. But local media in the US is dying. And in Switzerland, I don't know what the situation is, but like how good is the local newspaper in Zug? And I think questions like that are really fundamental questions when it comes to trying to answer this question about is democracy dying or not? And I work with national human rights institutions a lot, and there's a real unevenness. You can go to countries where no one is allowed to vote, yet there are nevertheless some quite strong human rights institutions, and vice versa. And I think we really have to unpack this big term democracy and look at all of these different elements.
I would say in Switzerland we still can say democracy is not dying, but it is not for granted. Democracy has to be learned because it's not working out of itself, You have to know how it functions. You have to be interested and invited to participate, It doesn't function out of itself, So I think it's important that also now in the new system, especially I think nowadays we have 1/3 of the preparation of a vote is in the electronic communication. In my time, we used to gather at public conferences to discuss, etc. This is no longer the case. It's hard to invite people to come to a public conference, although they then blame that they have not been properly informed. So I think one has to find new ways for this exchange of communication. But you see, it's interesting that you have the ability to decide about your future, about your environment, and I think it's worthwhile to fight for it.
We head to one more audience question.
So, before we mentioned the topic of trust, and this question is for Mr. Hess. During your time in the Bundestag, you faced a lot of scandal and speculation, and I was wondering whether you feel there might be a public or a rising public mistrust in elected officials and the political establishment, which is leading to such decisions as voting in Trump, voting in Brexit, or the rise of the AfD in Germany.
Well, I think in Switzerland we are not that far that we risk such development. We also have situations where there is a negative development also, but I think our institutions are strong enough to correct themselves, and in the final end, after 4 years, the people really has the possibility to not to elect a parliamentarian or so if they are not satisfied with the work he does, or of course if someone is misusing his position, there are several possibilities to oppose it, even on the level of the federal government. We had the situation that once a member of the federal government had been relieved of the position just on the fact that it was argued she has made a false statement, that's in fact possible, although it shouldn't be used too much, but I think in Switzerland we have correction factors which work still very properly.
I'd like to close the panel with one more question from Twitter, and I got plenty of these actually. There were probably 4 variations of this question, some from teachers, some from students, asking what we can do in schools to increase democratic participation, or what the valuable and pragmatic next steps for participating in democracy are for young people.
I think that's a really good question. I don't know if I should go first. I mean, I think that, again, there was a panel this morning about democracy that I attended, and there's a lot of talk about democracy as voting, and unfortunately all of you can't vote, although most of you can't vote, even though I think you should be able to. But I think that's only a narrow bit of democracy, and I think there's so many things you can do in your own school, and like, I don't know if you elect a student president, do you have a student newspaper that reports on local events, do you volunteer with local civil society organizations? All these things are kind of small, but that's democracy. Being able to participate in civic space and elect student leaders or have student newspapers, these are all part of democracy to me, and I think these are all things that you can do really, really, really effectively.
For those who don't find themselves to be public speakers or who aren't natural writers, what's the next step for those who wouldn't be involved in those sort of school institutions?
A little bit like them, I think there are a lot of things that you can do in school or in associations. That's a little bit why we created in Geneva Democracy Week. So every association or every group could invent what could they do to contribute to engage more and more people. And in school, I think it's not only civic education courses where we have to find, and maybe you have to put less maths and less languages to put that in. I think you can really mainstream it in almost all different subjects that you have. For example, geography or in English, in writing, and you can make discussion debates where people have to defend either sides, they have to prepare both, and they only know in the last minutes which side they will have to defend, and it can be kind of a contest and a fight. And you can make a petition. There is no minimal age for a petition, at least not in Switzerland. So I did mine at 8, my first one.
At 8 years old?
Yes. Well, I didn't went through because
what for?
It was to at that time we had 6 days of school a week, and I loved school, but I thought it was a bit too much anyway. So I wanted to have a weekend of 2 days. It was against Saturday school.
Right.
Yeah, it changed, but a bit later on.
It's not as a direct result of 8.
No, unfortunately not. Hopefully, it was part of the road.
So, Rosie, to the members of the audience who maybe ended up in this panel without realising they'd signed up for it and aren't looking to vote when they can, and are probably just waiting to get out of here to the next event, what would your advice be?
Well, I was going to say that, you know, if you were to have this conversation in a school in the Arab world, parts of the Arab world that I lived in, which is in the Gulf, your parents may get a knock on the door the next day, you would be facing certainly some pretty hefty detention, and possibly your parents would even be facing some jail time. Even the mention of democracy in Saudi, Qatar and UAE, I can reliably say, would all cause serious problems. And the cyberspace, which was a place for great freedom of speech in the Arab world, has gone very quiet. So for the quiet people that you were talking about, that's sort of where it's all at in the Arab world. And I think there's some lessons to be learned. And it's all just about finding where your passion lies. In politics, people often talk about these big, broad, mainstream terms, education, healthcare, things that we're told we should care about. But actually, is there a green space near you you'd like to make sure stays there? Is there a library that could do with your volunteering and maybe you could help do a talk there to keep it alive? Is there something small on a local scale that you can get involved in and not necessarily petition or speak or make a film or do all of these things that are very public, but maybe you can be the backbone of a small part of society quietly building up on what makes the building blocks of the foundations of our democracy, really.
when I was in Parliament, we started with so-called youth parliament on the federal level, but you also find now on cantonal level youth parliaments, which have a budget and where young people have the opportunity to learn, debate, they even have the possibility to vote on resolutions, etc. And I think that's a good tool to learn democracy, you know. And there are also other opportunities introduced now, like youth debate, where one is debating in a competition way political themes, and I think by this we can substitute the formal education party in the history or political life was still part of the school timetable.
Yes. Well, I'm afraid that brings our panel to a close. We've run out of time, but I would like to thank you all for being here, and I'd like a round of applause for the audience.